Senator Kerry.
The senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Kerry, may I ask you just one question? Because I was presiding yesterday when a member rose in opposition to the treaty and was complaining about it coming up now. And he pointed to when we got the treaty from the White House, and it was in May. Is that right?
Mr. President, that is correct. I would say to the senator from Minnesota, it was April that I think it was signed, and May that we actually received the submission of the documents themselves.
And I'd ask the chairman, isn't it true that, and this senator, I was presiding, and I was listening on the floor, and he was saying, we got this in May, and now it's this close to the end of the year, and that's outrageous that we're doing it now and in May. But I'd ask the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Kerry, didn't we accommodate, or didn't you accommodate those on the other side of this issue because several times who had asked for delay themselves?
Mr. President, the senator is absolutely correct that there were a series of requests from senators on the other side, which are totally appropriate, incidentally. I'm not suggesting that was inappropriate, but I think the record needs to reflect that on those multiple occasions when people requested time in order to be able to prepare, we gave them time. Senator Lugar, in fact, was importuned some 13 times specifically to slow down the treaty process in order to allow for more time to be able to address the modernization process, which is outside of the treaty, but not unlinked to it in terms of sort of how you make judgments about this. And Senator Kyle appropriately brought up some very relevant omissions in that modernization process, and that extra time allowed us to address that. And I think I hope to his satisfaction, certainly to the improvement of an understanding of where we're proceeding and to an increase of funds. Then we delayed even further. The committee was prepared to vote. There was a request for delay. We delayed that vote. And then we delayed even after that in order to avoid the appearance of politicizing the treaty for the election. So we literally took it out and said, okay, we'll do it after the election, which is why I think people feel so adamantly that now is the time, that there's been an appropriate series of delays. And you can't come in and ask for a delay and ask for a delay and then say, oh my gosh, we're sort of pushed up against the calendar. It's difficult to do it now, particularly since we're in day 3 and we have plenty of time to even exceed the amount of time that we did start 1 in. So I thank the senator for clarifying that. What I hope to do now is not get locked into a discussion of process or of what happened when. Let's just do the substance of the treaty and show the country that we have the ability to, in a bipartisan way, meet the national security needs of our nation. And I thank the senator for his question.
I thank the chairman for the clarification. Mr. President, I rise today to discuss missile defense and the new START treaty. Missile defense is one of the persistent areas of concern of the treaty raised by some of my colleagues. However, the reasonable questions that have been raised on the subject can be answered in a very straightforward manner. The treatment of missile defense in the treaty is no cause to oppose it, quite the opposite. It should garner support for the treaty. Most of those who have raised concern understand that long-standing Russian anxiety about our missile defense is misplaced. The purpose of our missile defense is not to undermine Russia's deterrent. It is to protect us from attack from the likes of Iran or North Korea. In fact, the senator who raised the objection about it coming up now after their request for delay pointed out as if our side didn't understand that for some reason. This is longstanding U.S. policy and law across administrations. and Congress is controlled by both parties going back to at least the administration of George H.W. Bush. Nothing in the treaty bars the development and deployment of missile defense for countering those very real threats from the likes of Iran and North Korea, nor does the treaty give the Russians any say over missile defense or any kind of veto over it. The fact that we and the Russians remain at odds over missile defense is, to some degree, nothing new. It has not prevented overwhelming support for arms control agreements in the past, including this treaty's predecessor, the original START Treaty. A more radical strand of criticism argues that our missile defense should target Russian forces and should, in fact, seek to render Russian strategic forces useless. I won't have much to say about this criticism. In reality, it's a criticism of the entire foreign policy consensus of the United States that has prevailed across party lines, at least since the end of the Cold War. Secretary Gates has spoken about the danger and the needless budget-busting expense of this perspective. So setting this view aside, I want to focus on the more reasonable skeptics of the new START Treaty. They have expressed concerns about each of the two mentions of missile defense in the treaty. Article 5, Section 3 of the treaty states, and I quote, "Each party shall not convert, shall not use ICBM launchers and SLBM launchers at submarine launched ballistic missiles for placement of missile defense interceptors therein. Each party further shall not convert and shall not use launchers of missile defense interceptors for placement of ICBM and SLBMs therein. This provision shall not apply to ICBM launchers that were converted prior to the signature of this treaty for placement of missile defense interceptors therein." In other words, this provision prohibits the conversion and use of ICBM and SLBM launchers for missile defense interceptors and vice versa. However, it grandfathers the 5 missile silos at Vandenberg Air Force Base that have already been converted to launchers for missile defense interceptors. Some have seized on this provision as a constraint on our missile defense. In reality, this provision effectively keeps missile defense outside the scope of the treaty, an objective that proponents of missile defense surely desire at no real cost to us. The ban on conversion of ICBM silos or SLBM launchers to missile defense is not a meaningful constraint. As Lieutenant General Patrick O'Reilly, the director of the Missile Defense Agency, testified, his agency has no plans and never had any plans to convert additional ICBM silos at Vandenberg. It's both less expensive and operationally more effective to build new ground-based interceptors. As General O'Reilly explained, replacing ICBMs with interceptors or adapting SLBMs to B interceptors would, quote, be a major setback to the development of our missile defenses. Substantial conversion of ICBM silos to missile defense would also be unnecessarily risky. Mixing interceptors with their ICBMs, especially in or near ICBM fields, would create an ambiguity problem for the Russians that risks tragic misunderstanding and devastating miscalculation. As General Kevin Chilton, commander of U.S. Strategic Command, put it, seeing a missile launch, the other side may well be uncertain whether the launch was of an offensive or a defensive missile. Eliminating conversion of ICBM silos to defense is eliminating an unnecessary and undesirable option. That's why this so-called limitation on missile defense in Article 5 of the new START Treaty is, to use Senator McCain's phrase from the committee hearings, not a meaningful one. Nevertheless, Senator McCain and others have gone on to ask, even if the limitation is meaningful in itself, why did the administration agree to include it in the treaty? Why did we make this concession on missile defense to the Russians? The answer is, because it is a meaningful concession. It is a meaningful concession to the Russians. 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 It is a meaningful concession The short answer is because we got a very good deal on missile defense, gaining several benefits by agreeing not to do something we were never going to do. That's pretty good negotiating, I think. The 5 converted missile silos at Vandenberg were a major source of contention in the context of the existing original START treaty. The Russians considered the conversion of those silos a compliance problem. They worried that we'd be able to convert them back and forth and undermine the treaty's central numerical limits on nuclear weapons. Apparently, in negotiations over the new treaty, the Russians pushed us either to undo the conversions to missile defense at Vandenberg or to count the silos under the new START central limitations on our arsenal. We met neither of those Russian demands. Instead, in return for agreeing not to perform future conversions that are unnecessary and undesirable, we got the 5 existing missile defense silos at Vandenberg grandfathered. That means not only do they continue as defense silos, but Russia can no longer raise compliance complaints because we converted those silos to defense. More importantly, with the conversion ban in place, our missile defenses are not subject to the treaty and its inspection regime. It's true that we will exhibit the Vandenberg silos to the Russians on 2 occasions in the future to assure them that the 5 converted silos remain unable to launch ICBMs. But by keeping Vandenberg out of the regular inspection and verification regime established by the new treaty, we deprive the Russians of a precedent for extending inspections to our defenses elsewhere. If conversion were allowed under the new START treaty, our missile defenses at Fort Greely, for instance, would potentially be subject to intrusive inspection by the Russians to determine whether any such conversions had taken place. Instead, with the conversion ban in place, Fort Greely and other missile defenses are off limits. I'm not entirely sure why the Russians agreed to this, but it's very good for us, and our negotiators deserve praise for Article 5, Section 3. We kept something of value, namely the existing Vandenberg converted silos. We cleared up a source of contention with the Russians, and we kept our missile defenses out of the new START regime, ensuring that they are not subject to intrusive inspection by the Russians. In exchange, we agreed to ban something, again, that we were never going to do, further convert silos, because that would be unwise in the first place. In other words, Article 5 is a good reason to support the treaty. But I think the deepest concern of those who have raised questions about missile defense go to the treaty's other reference to missile defense. In the preamble, together with the unilateral statement Russia issued on its own on the subject and the so-called withdrawal clause in the treaty. The treaty's preamble recognizes, quote, the existence of the interrelationship between strategic offensive arms and strategic defensive arms, that this interrelationship will become more important as strategic arms, nuclear arms, are reduced, and that current strategic defense arms do not undermine the viability and effectiveness of the strategic offensive arms of the parties, unquote. I don't think anyone would deny that there is such an interrelationship. It's simply a fact. Nor does the preamble impose any obligation on us or on the Russians. It is not a binding limit on us, requires nothing of us, and has no effect on the nuclear forces limited or not limited by the treaty. Russia also issued a unilateral statement on missile defense at the time the treaty was signed. This is not part of the treaty, and there is no binding force whatsoever on us or on the Russians. We issued a statement in response as well. Russia's unilateral statement asserts that the treaty can only be effective and viable where there's no qualitative or quantitative buildup in our missile defense system capabilities. That is not what the actual treaty's preamble says. Beyond that, the unilateral statement goes on to state that a missile defense buildup, quote, such that it would give rise to a threat to the strategic nuclear force potential of the Russian Federation would count as an extraordinary event under Article 14 of the treaty. Article 14 includes the withdrawal clause, which is a standard part of arms control treaties. That clause makes clear that each country has the right to withdraw from the treaty if it judges that extraordinary events related to the treaty's subject matter have jeopardized its supreme interests. That judgment cannot be second-guessed. Russia or the U.S. can always make a decision that its supreme interests require it to withdraw from the treaty under Article 14, and there's nothing the other party can do about it. Some of my colleagues on the other side are troubled and worried that Russia will seek to leverage the mention of missile defense in the preamble and their unilateral statement to pressure the U.S. to limit our missile defense. These worries are without foundation. The preamble and unilateral statement add no force whatsoever to Article 14's power of withdrawal from the treaty. And as Secretary Gates testified, we know the Russians have hated missile defense for decades, since strategic arms talks started. There's no surprise there. So it is no surprise that the Russians say a fundamental change in the strategic balance between our countries because of missile defense might lead them to withdraw from the treaty. But even that threat is far less than it's been made out to be by the treaty's critics. Even the Russians' own unilateral statement counts only a missile defense buildup that, quote, would give rise to a threat to the strategic nuclear force potential of the Russian Federation, unquote, as potential cause for withdrawal. Right now, we have 30 ground-based interceptors, and the Russians will be able to deploy up to 1,500 nuclear warheads. It's accepted that you need at least 2 interceptors for each threat missile. We can and will continue to improve and deploy our missile defense without changing the fundamental situation with Russia. We can improve and expand our missile defense without threatening strategic stability with Russia. U.S. missile defense simply won't meet the Russians' own description of cause for withdrawal. But suppose the Russians see things otherwise. What is it that the Russians are actually threatening? Are they threatening the withdrawal from the treaty? No. Here is what President Medvedev said on April 9th, the day after the treaty was signed, with reference to missile defense. Quote, if events develop in such a way to ultimately change the fundamental situation, Russia would be able to raise this issue with the USA. This is the sense of the interpretation and the verbal statement made yesterday, unquote. So, if the Russians decide that there has been a change in the fundamental situation on missile defense and offense, then they will, and I quote, raise this issue with the USA. Not withdraw from the treaty, raise the issue with us. That is a threat I think we can handle. There's another reason not to be overly concerned. Around the time the U.S. and the Soviet Union signed the original START Treaty in 1991, the Soviet Union issued a unilateral statement on the Anti-Ballistic Missile, or ABM, Treaty, whose language is virtually identical to the unilateral statement the Russians just issued in connection with the new START Treaty. As you know, the U.S. did withdraw from the ABM Treaty, and Russia, the successor to the USSR, did not, in turn, withdraw from the original START Treaty, as they threatened to do in a unilateral statement. Why would the Russians structure their unilateral statement exactly like their previous one if they wanted to take the threat us to take the threat more seriously than the last one? The Russian objection to missile defense is well known and well understood. Their threat to withdraw from the treaty, such as it is not strong. And the treaty's actual preamble imposes no obligation, restraint, or pressure upon us. The bottom line is that whatever decisions the Obama administration and Congress make on missile defense policy can and will be made independent of Russian threats. And frankly, our missile defense will not threaten strategic stability with them. The New START Treaty doesn't alter our calculations on missile defense one iota. If this is Russia's effort to pressure us on missile defense, it's very weak and easily resisted. I personally pledge to make judgments about our missile defense policy on the basis of technical and strategic considerations entirely independent of Russian pressure, and I'm sure my colleagues will do the same. To sum up, the limitation on conversion of launchers in Article 5 of the New START Treaty is, in fact, a major success of our negotiators. In return for agreeing not to convert more ICBM solos, which we were never going to do anyway, we kept our missile defense out of the treaty and away from regular Russian inspection. And we put to rest, Russian complaints about our existing converted silos. We got several things of value at very, very, very low cost. Similarly, the mention of missile defense in the preamble and the non-binding statement made by the Russians will not allow them to pressure us or exercise a veto on our missile defense. There is no meaningful pressure there. The threat is exceedingly weak, and it's hard to see how my colleagues would take it seriously. There's simply not a missile defense problem with this treaty. But don't just take it from me. In addition to the extraordinary support this treaty has garnered from foreign policy experts across the political spectrum, there's remarkable support among our defense leadership responsible for missile defense. This ranges from the Secretary of Defense to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the service chiefs, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command responsible for our nuclear deterrent, and the director of the Missile Defense Agency. What's more, 7 former commanders of Strategic Air Command and U.S. Strategic Command recently wrote to the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees to express their support for ratification of the treaty and specifically dismiss objections based on missile defense. I hope that we consider the resolution of ratification on the floor of the Senate as soon as possible. The substantive case for the treaty could not be stronger. It's time to bring it into force. Thank you, Mr. President.